Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the early chapters of Book 2 of his Discourses, Epictetus is raising some very interesting questions about the compatibility or the incompatibility of certain, let's call them either qualities or comportments, ways in which people engage themselves or orient themselves towards the world and also towards themselves and their own engagement with the world and with other people. Now, the terms that he's using are translated as confidence, caution, and care or concern. Confidence is, the verb for it would be thaurein. Thauros is the feeling, and it means something like, walking in and feeling like everything's okay. You know how you're going to do. You're not worried about anything. It's the sort of thing that is displayed by, animals, for example, when they are rushing out to get their prey or defending their young or things like that. Thauros. Caution, eulabeia, or the verb eulabesthai. Literally what that means is like taking a good grasp on something. But remember that the Stoics use a lot of terms from that verb of grasping, lambane, for mental acts, or you might say perceptive acts, right? How we grasp things. So caution means sort of like, getting in there and looking around, making sure everything is the way it ought to be. And then concern, epimeleia. This is a term that was around for quite a while as well, when we talk about, the care of the self or things like that as being part of ancient philosophy. It's this term and its cognates that we have in mind, to give concern to give care to pay attention to. So the question then is, look, Stoicism teaches us that there's two kinds of things. Those that are in our control, those that we have some measure of control over because they actually fall within the scope of our faculty of choice, and then all those things that are outside of our control. So shouldn't we ideally be trying to attain a state where we're just not bothered by anything and we can feel confident all the time? We certainly don't want to feel, a sense of care or, caution towards external things, right? Because they're not that important. Or are they? Well, that's the question here. So Epictetus is going to say these qualities would be incompatible if we were going to try, if the same person was going to show them to the same thing at the same time. But in fact, we need to be displaying both of these towards different things that we are encountering, including ourselves. So towards what falls within the scope of our faculty of choice, that's where our genuine good and bad lie, right? Not in these external things, which are, strictly speaking, indifferent. That means they don't have a positive or a negative value in themselves. We ought to, he says, have care and concern and caution. And if we don't, we're really setting ourselves up for all sorts of problems, aren't we? We'll get to that in just a moment. Now, by contrast, we should have confidence towards external things. Why? Because they can't really hurt us. So we can go into any situation, say, for example, performing, right? He's got a lot of discussions about performers, and they get very anxious about playing. Why? Because they're too concerned with what the audience thinks, something they have no control whatsoever about. Just be confident in your own art, in your skill. Go in there, play. If your goal is to make good music, you can do that. If your goal is to give a good lecture, you can do that. If other people applaud, that's, as we say, the icing on the cake, or we often say that's the gravy, right? But that's not something that you need to be concerned with. And we can have an attitude of untroubledness, not only with respect to our own stuff, but things that are other people's, things that are the world's. We can not be affected by them, and that should be how we ought to behave. Now, if we try to do that globally and we don't pay attention to our own faculty of choice, which doesn't start out automatically choosing the right things, as a matter of fact, is most likely from the Stoic perspective quite damaged, quite deformed by the time that we begin to scrutinize it, then we're going to have all sorts of problems. And we're not going to even be able to be confident about things that are external to us because we're going to be valuing them too much. So, he's got an example here from chapter 1 of book 2, confidence towards death. We should feel confident in the face of death. Why? Because death itself is not an evil to us. What we ought to have caution about is whether we're feeling a fear of death. And then we have to think about, well, why are we fearing death? Death by itself is not an evil. It just is, an indifferent. It is something that is, and it's our attitude towards it that causes us so much anguish or anxiety. We can go on with all sorts of other similar examples where, there's some sort of thing that presents itself to us, and we can be confident in relation to it, and we ought to be confident, the Stoics say, precisely because we take caution or care about what it is that we ourselves are thinking, what it is that we are making of it, how are we feeling about it, how does it affect our desires and aversions? Are we confining our desires and aversions here, or are we letting them stray out into the world where they're going to get us into trouble? A little bit later on, he will say in that same chapter that it's precisely because we take caution over here in the things that we need to take caution in the things that lie within the realm of our moral purpose or faculty of choice, or proeresis, that we then can feel confidence towards the other things, the external things. If we don't do that, we're not going to have that confidence as a sustainable comportment. He also raises an interesting question about care and concern. Should we exhibit any sort of care or concern about these externals? We know we should have about ourselves, right? We should pay attention to what's going on our part, but those external things, do they really matter? They're indifferent morally, so why can't we just be careless with them? If my bike doesn't matter, what is it, if I leave it out in the rain, who's harmed by that, right? The bike rusts, it's not a big deal. Well, Epictetus says it's not quite so simple as that. Our uses of indifference has a moral value and affects us. So what would be indifference? Indifferent externals. Well, he gives us some examples. Actually, quite a few, which are quite good. He says, think about skillful ball players. None of them is concerned about the ball as being something good or bad, but about throwing it and catching it. Accordingly, form has to do with that, skill with that, and speed and grace. Where I cannot catch the ball even if I spread out my cloak, the expert catches it if I throw. Yet if we catch or throw the ball in a flurry or in fear, what fun is there left? And how can a man be steady or see what comes next in the game? But one player will say throw, another don't throw, and yet another don't throw it up. That indeed would be a strife and not a game. And then he says, this is like Socrates going into his lawsuit, the suit in which he actually would become condemned to death. He says he knew how to play in the law court. And what does he mean by that? Well, instead of being concerned with how the game was going to turn out, he played the game. He went into his case confident, knowing that he doesn't control the jury, and he was going to tell the truth, and he was going to cross-examine his accuser, and he was going to make a case to the Athenian people. And he did it, right? He used the externals well. And so Epictetus is saying we need to have that sort of attitude of care, or attentiveness might be another way to translate it, towards all these things that are, that we have some measure of, not necessarily control over, but at least some determinative factor. And he says, are externals to be used carelessly? Not at all. For this again is to the moral purpose an evil and thus unnatural to it. They must be used carefully, because their use is not a matter of indifference, and at the same time with steadfastness and peace of mind, because the material is indifferent. So again, we should feel untroubled, but also careful, even with respect to these external things. What happens if we get this wrong? Well, he gives us some great examples of this in chapter 1. He says, when we're cautious about the things that are really evil, the result will be that we have confidence in regard to the things that are not of that nature. That's when things are aligned right. However, we act like deer. When the hinds are frightened by the feathers and run away from them, where do they turn, and to what do they fly for refuge as a safe retreat? Right into the nets. The hunters know this, that they can get the deer to run into traps. As a matter of fact, human beings have been hunting species, since we've been, not even civilized, since we began working together, we hunted species, many of them to extinction. So he says, so it is with us also. Where do we show fear? About the things which lie outside the province of the moral purpose. Again, in which do we behave with confidence as if there were no danger in the things that concern the moral purpose? So many of us have our priorities screwed up when it comes to that. We're careless, we're overconfident about how our moral purpose, how our character, how the fabric of our personality is being improved or being destroyed and deformed by our actions. And we worry about externals. We allow ourselves to become upset by them. We allow our desires and aversions to go around willy-nilly in the world and draw us along by the nose and get us into all sorts of troubles in the sense of being disturbed. So if we want to have the proper arrangement of these comportments, this is what it would look like for us. By paying attention to our, what is within the scope of our power, what is within ourselves, we can have the right attitude of confidence and also, care or concern for how we use externals.